Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's enlightening session. We appreciate your participation in our session titled "The State is Colonialism, Ecocide, Counter-insurgency, and the Colonial Present, a Conversation with Xander Dunlap." I am Sasha Cornejo, and it's my privilege to serve as your moderator. Today's agenda begins with a compelling lecture by Dr. Xander Dunlap, followed by an interactive Q&A session where we will engage with questions from the audience. Please be aware that this session will be recorded for educational purposes. This event is proudly presented by the decolonial research group in partnership with the Student Coalition Berlin. We are a collective of students who are deeply concerned by the ongoing genocide in Palestine and the escalating censorship in Germany. I will now share a brief statement from our DeCoco collective, providing a bit of an insight into our stance and the challenge we face as students from the Global South, advocating against genocide while studying in Germany. And it says, "We are witnessing unprecedented violence with the criminal complicity of European and US governments. Therefore, we believe that we are in a crucial moment to redefine and situate the anti-colonial struggle in its various manifestations. As students and researchers on extractivism and environmental conflicts, we at the DeCoco have no doubt that extractivism is one of the many manifestations of capitalist violence. Yet, we have been criticized by the academic institution from which we are students in Germany, institutions supposedly concerned with the environmental catastrophe we are living, for dealing in this lecture series and in our work with issues that are, from their point of view, and I quote, far from the problem of sustainability and the environment. For us, end quote, for us, it is clear that those who execute genocidal violence against the Palestinian people are the same that destroy the planet and are moved by the same purposes of racist domination and exploitation, both of human and of the earth. Both forms of violence cannot be dissociated. Finally, as a collective of students experiencing pressure from university authorities, we have decided to stop naming the university or its institutions in any of our events as repudiation of their silent complicity and the ongoing genocide and their censorship practices against the Palestinian people and against the interests and lives of the people of the Global South. This is the end of the statement. So, turning back to our lecture, I will introduce Dr. Xander Dunlap. Dr. Dunlap is a distinguished research fellow at the Institute of Global Sustainability, Boston University, and a visiting fellow at the Department of Global Development Studies, University of Helsinki. He has dedicated his career to critically analyzing the intersection of police-military dynamics, market-oriented conservation, wind energy initiatives, and broader extractive undertaken across Latin America, Europe, and the US. With 4 seminal books to his name, Renewing Destruction of 2019, The Violent Technology of Extraction of 2020, Enforcing Ecocide 2022, and The System is Killing Us 2024. He will present his book on Monday in Berlin. Note, his contributions are invaluable. We extended our heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Dunlap for his willingness to share his insight with us today. Without further ado, I am honored to give the floor to Dr. Dunlap.
All right, y'all, really appreciate it. And yeah, I just want to send my gratitude and appreciation to Sasha and Jorge for inviting me, and especially for the DeCoco group for taking this stance in Germany right now and actually calling out this genocide and also, of course, implicitly ecocide that's going on in Palestine. It's shameful what the European Commission, as per normal, is doing in terms of the support of this, as well as the US and pretty much the majority of states, and especially the way that academia is repressing these thoughts. So I just can't stress enough my appreciation of y'all holding it down there. and kind of speaking out against this in what is ultimately an odd political context in Germany. But so with that, thanks so much for introducing me. We're gonna kind of get into statism as colonialism, resisting counterinsurgency ecocide in the neo-colonial present. Yeah, but before I get into this, today, last December was a rough time for anarchists, specifically with the death of Alfredo Embanano, who's probably one of the most important anarchist theorists to be, not only as a theorist, but also someone who was very much a man of action. You know, in 72 was arrested for bank robbery in Greece, among countless of actions and imprisonments for the things that they've written and done in terms of anti-authoritarian struggle. And with that, I rest in peace and a good passing in power. And I think it's rather important, since a lot of their work has been shunned and ignored in academia, obviously for the combative kind of practice going on there, and also anarchists in general largely ignoring the university for its kind of complicity in what universities do, which we all know well. And also Klee Ben Ali, who unfortunately, meeting a much earlier death in line with Diné and Navajo statistics in the US, is someone who rather famous and important for actually mixing Diné cosmology, ontology, and epistemology with anarchist ideas, but more importantly, really the way that Diné ideas have resonate and work with and even advance ideas of anarchy and anarchism. And I mean, with it, I believe it's a gift, and I wrote a book review for this, that his first book came out about 6 weeks before they died, and I can't recommend it enough. It's called No Spiritual Surrender, and it's right there. And the first pressing sold out, and I guess the second press is going. So I just want to, all my presentations this year and will be dedicated to these two figures for their thoughts and actions and the tensions that they've held in their lives. So today, here's a little outline, fun little academic outlines. This is how we do in academia. We got to give a little structure, let people know where we're going. But one thing that I think is really fun to kind of start this is actually to go back sometime. And this goes back to a time, and since DeCoco is hosted in Berlin, I want to take this back to a time when American Indian professor Ward Churchill, along with others, was on a speaking tour in Germany in 1994. And you can find what I'm kind of reading out here in their chapter, Indians Are Us. So, your American question. Churchill is reiterating, after giving lots of public talks all across Germany, he says, the question most frequently asked by those who turned out to hear me speak on the struggles for liberation in Native North America was, what can we do to help? And he replied, quite uniformly, the answer I provided, the most important assistance the people in the audience could render American Indians would be to win their own struggles for liberation in Germany. I reiterated time after time, this would eliminate the German corporate state as a linchpin of global political economic order in which the United States, along with others, serves as a hub. Let me move the Zoom thing. Oh no. There we go. And he continues, you must understand that I really mean it when I say we are all related, stressing this kind of connection in terms of global connections via repression, but also our connections to the earth. Yeah. So the oppositional concern, as it continues, the usual drift of these responses was that the German and American Indian situation and resulting struggles are entirely different, and thus not to be compared in the manner I've attempted, because Indians are colonized peoples while the Germans are colonizers. Indians, the audience went on, must therefore fight to free our occupied and underdeveloped land base, while the German opposition, effectively landless, struggles to rearrange social and economic relations within an advanced industrial society. Native people in America hold the advantage of possessing cultures separate and distinct from that which we oppose. We must contend that the circumstances of being essentially culturalist and disoriented. Okay. Churchill starts getting to the point. As a long-term participant in the national liberation struggles of American Indians, I said, we've been forced into knowing the nature of colonialism very well. Along with you, we've understand that colonization we've experienced finds its origins in the matrix of European culture. But apparently, unlike you, we also understand that in order for Europe to do what it has done to us, in fact, for Europe to become Europe at all, it first had to do the same thing to all of you. In other words, to be a colonizing culture, Europe first had to colonize itself. To the extent that this is true, I find it fair to say that if our struggles must be explicitly anti-colonial in its form, content, aspirations, yours must be even more so. You have, after all, been colonized far longer than we have, and therefore much more completely. In fact, your colonization has by now been consolidated to such an extent that, with certain notable exceptions like the Irish and the Basque nationalists, you no longer even see yourselves of having been colonized. The result is that you've been self-colonizing, conditioned to be as self-identified with your own oppression, that you've lost your ability to see it for what it is, much less to resist it in any coherent way. So, I believe Churchill's words are rather relevant for a lot of things. Not only for us to kind of reflect that the way that people are tokenizing the global South and those struggles there, and failing to reflect on their own mentalities and where they are, which for some reason, 20 or whatever years later, is ringing harder and louder than it ever has, with the way that people in Germany, specifically their institutions and the people within them, are refusing to acknowledge that genocide is happening in Palestine. So again, I think now is as good of a time as ever to really reflect on actually the structures that we're a part of. And this really is fundamentally the point and what this is about. It's to really stress that statism is colonialism. And as we can think of Patrick Wolf here, in terms of how in non-determinate phases, we can roughly understand colonialism. And I'm jumping ahead in the presentation, but we can roughly understand colonialism as conquest, genocide, ecocide, internment, reservation, concentration camps, assimilation. And I myself added on something, self-management, to the point where your assimilation becomes so intense that you self-manage these institutions and reproject these values and ideas. This is the main thing. This is the way to understand that statism in itself is the main body, is the main modality, is the main form of organization, perspective that underlines colonialism. You had to actually implement these models in Europe first. You had to destroy the wetlands. You had to destroy and subjugate people. You had to, sometimes it was called religious wars. Sometimes it was called witch hunts, but you're seeing the same shuffling, extermination, homogenization to even create these, quote, imperial and European or monarchical or state powers that then had to go forth and had to bring this lovely model of political economy to the world. But so, yeah, let's talk about maybe a bit more specifically about what is statism. The practice, this is looking at a dictionary, the practice or doctrine of giving a centralized government control over economic planning and policy. Okay, so a lot of the Marxist and Leninist colleagues out there, they really, they might really agree with this. They're aiming for statism. Second, the art of government, hence in a depreciative sense and policy. 3, the art of governing a statecraft policy. The belief that the centralization of power in a state is the ideal or best way to organize humanity. So this really is about class structure. This really is about hierarchical systems. And obviously with hierarchy comes racism, comes ideas of human supremacy, comes ideas of flat ontology that for some reason wants to view a whole plethora of existences, lives, and beings as inert material and resources to be mined, so you can have really cool technologies, guns, and really the enchantments of modernity, which, as addicting and enchanting and impressive they are, I'm not sure are leading the world to the place we want to be. And if there's not 100 million other examples in terms of antidepressants, suicides, police violence, we'll always have climate change, extreme weather conditions, and like this, and signs from the planet and our ecosystems to look at. Of course, this goes back, one of the big theorists, fortunately, and especially in a decolonial lecture, we have an old white guy with statism and anarchy, but at least this old white guy, despite turning his back on his class privilege, engaged in systemic struggle to fight against these structures and statism. But there's kind of the idea is like, okay, but where did the state come from? Did this just kind of pop up after the Treaty of Versailles or whatever the main treaty it was? They kind of formed and kind of consolidated different empires. And this kind of goes back to the idea of civilization and that kind of the foundation of the state. You can find a lot of the same features of the state and statism in civilization itself. We can call it civilization, empire, monarchy, state. And we can locate these things, and there's a lot of different bodies of theory. We've got world system theory, is this 500 or 5,000 years looking at these things? We have, James C. Scott, the more anarchist approach, who is really looking at the first kind of states. Again, he's in the debates with talking with different archaeologists and Ivy League kind of universities in that book, but still a good point. We have the same year coming out of the anarchist camp, but also from out of the squats in Barcelona, Peter Gedelu's Worshipping Power. Super interesting in looking at the mechanics of power in terms of actually how states divide and conquer people. And of course, the dawn of everything that's recently, we got the sociology of freedom. And we also have a lot of eco-anarchists, who've been really actually promoting anti-civilization thought and really bringing back the problem of the state to civilization. And this goes back to the key features, again, centralized government. And let's remember, there's something called administrative decentralization. This is what they call in planning circles of a way that you're still organizing things in a hierarchical way, but you're actually promoting self-identification and autonomy. And through colonial ventures, this was often through Spanish strategies of indirect rule, which unfortunately still permeate even the more chaotic and decentralized countries in Latin America. And I'm thinking of Mexico, and specifically they dealt with more unruly areas that were never even conquered during Spanish conquest. Hierarchy, class, caste, of course, related to race and all this, which then of course relates to divisions of labor and specialization. And obviously to have a craft is important, to have skills is great, but these extreme divisions of labor become completely toxic. And I think Ivan Illich is a great thinker who really chastised and went against this kind of specialization and the professional, and the way that this was eroding autonomy and stripping people of their ability to know themselves, to be able to take care of themselves and to do these things and more or less structure them into a system of dependence. And especially this comes with ideas of neo-colonialism or development that was really, projecting a certain Western standard across the world to pretty much lead the world through mass consumerism. And yeah, so obviously there's a hierarchy to this, of all the conversations of everything, it's going to be the mountains, it's going to be the trees, it's going to be the rivers, it's going to be the animals who are getting this first. Extermination is almost an ideological celebration, especially even from the critical Marxist camp that really doesn't want to acknowledge these life forms and existences, which I think is a huge problem. And obviously undergirding these hierarchies is patriarchy and the kind of male domination and kind of promoting these things. But again, this goes back to divisions of labor, creating place, divisions between the public, the political, these completely artificial divisions within ecosystems and habitats. And then ethnic, caste, class, enclosure, really demarcating lines and establishing property, making systems of servitude or even drudgerous work. And then obviously this goes with paying taxes, tribute, duty, call it what you will, organized warfare to subjugate them. And of course, the way of empires, civilizations, and states was to take advantage of internal discord and disagreements between kind of disparate and autonomous indigenous groups to pin them against each other. And it really is this kind of strategy of divide and conquer to actually absorb people into a system that obviously it's not completely negative. There's going to always be some type of enchantment. There's always going to be some type of product, technology, or maybe a sense of rights, ultimately a psychosocial manipulation, if not real benefit in terms of kind of joining these systems. And that's how capitalism, that's how states, that's how these things are. It doesn't fully operate in just repression, but boy, terrorization and genocide and ecocide are certainly processing that. And of course, ecocide is crucial to destroy. And this goes to colonialism in terms of really talking about the way you make people dependent and try to break their will to fight is to destroy their land base. If you are living, contrary to popular belief, food actually comes from the land. As much as we get it in supermarkets, it actually comes from the land first. And so one of the key things to do is to create this dependency on infrastructural and modernist systems. And especially in colonial warfare, this meant eradicating poisoning water, food sources, eliminating forests in general, not only because they were harvesting and creating food, but they're also giving shelter to insurgent fighters. And obviously in Turtle Island, in native North America, you have obviously the way that the bison were kind of exterminated, and how in order to break a lot of the kind of the quote plains wars or Indian wars in the so-called United States, you more or less had this eradication of the animals, of the food, as a way to try to break people to force them to come pander around the forts and to ultimately betray their people. And that's the thing. And it's been a well-known technology, whether from English industrialism or to colonial conquest. Instituting and enforcing hunger is a way to break people and bring them into things. But yeah, colonialism is about absorption and exploitation, if not extermination. And maybe that's the difference between settler colonialism, is that one is the colonialism is, and obviously thinking of Patrick Wolf and so many other scholars here, in terms of the way that people are absorbed and exploited. And then there's also clearance. Again, Gaza maybe resonates here in terms of actually trying to clear and replace the people of that land with someone else. And as I spoke before, this comes in three phases of there's often a genocidal phase or conquest, internment, assimilation, and I'd say self-management. And really what we're still witnessing in a couple other places in the world, I mean, what's going on in Yemen is horrible, but really in Palestine, we are still witnessing things in a genocidal and internment phase. I mean, the efforts at assimilation are obviously there, but it's really at this exterminating level, and this is horrendous. And again, internal invasion, external invasion, occupation. This is a crucial feature of colonialism, right? We're always thinking of colonialism as an external force coming in. But where do we draw this line between internal and external? Yeah. So when states demarcate a boundary, then all the external enemy in this kind of geopolitical conflict, have you, is the enemy. But what about the subjects and the citizens that have been claimed, some willfully, believing in the empire, monarchy, and the rights that have been bestowed upon them, the social contract, which don't know where that myth has gone, but it's certainly gone. But, what about the subjects of empire? Those accepting, but so many more resisting, so many more in that situation because of a process of conquest and takeover. And this is just a stress that divide and conquer and resource control is foundational to all this. And that's the thing, under capitalism, under statism, people are understood as commodities, as resources to be moved around and shuffled, to be used in war. The wealth of nations in Adam Smith, this is just the idea of people. And this also relates to methods and processes of reproduction to really encourage people to produce so they can go work in factories, they can be used in fodder for war. Power was in reproduction. And it's sickening. It's sickening the way that humans and people are even treated and they're treated, dehumanized, you can say, but this is almost disrespectful to animals in the way that it's a problem of actually how we treat our ecosystems, how we relate to them, and how everything, and we can call it thingification, as Emi Cesar, I believe, called it. And again, yeah, this is a real kind of appreciation of Cesar, who really was one of the first to just say, hey, fascism is colonialism. This is something that was going on forever, and it came back to Europe, and really called it out. And I think that was really important. And fascism is the colonialism for white people, you could say. And people are treated like, people are ultimately just being treated like trees, rivers, soils, and mountains, the same way that trees are enclosed to be harvested, humans are. But this is obviously a much more complex process, of exploitation and use. And colonization, colonialism hinges on the idea of invasion and occupation. I think this is the main thing. And I think this is one of the big points of this kind of statism as colonialism, is how are you identifying with these structures? Are you right now celebrating these things? Do you self-identify in them? Whether it's a colonial system or a statist system, depending on the context and history where you are. Because we all know that ultimately colonialism was the exportation of statism based along certain racial lines. But this is what's interesting, and what is very strange is actually how normal and desensitized these processes are. This is from Boris and Franco, and so this is from Critical Agrarian Studies, Political Ecology, Environmental Justice. They say when the land is needed, but labor is not, the most likely outcome is the expulsion of people from the land. Yeah, so this is a really nice way to say that ultimately this kind of extractive and really violent process. This isn't so much different than saying that when settler colonizers come to stay, invasion is a structure, not an event. And that you're going to see similar kind of overlaps and similar processes, but the only difference is really the intensity of the violence. Some more exterminating than others, some more trying to just integrate you to an abusive migration corridor to go work in factories, either within that country or to try to cross borders into the so-called overdeveloped north. Yeah, so statism is colonialism. Trying to get to it. I don't want to spend too much time talking about what is actually a rather simple point. The state is the structure of socio-ecological conquest. So when Wolff talks about the structure of conquest, it's the state, it's statism. Obviously, maybe he draws this line a bit more, but he doesn't say that so explicitly. This is my reading. And I would say that the state is an evolution of colonialism. And that's why right now, brackets, neo-colonialism. It's the same process, same trajectory, same processes, but there are differences in technologies, the way people are reacting, and how they're being integrated into different structures. I mean, and obviously borders, central authority, hierarchy, divisions of labor, the objectives and ecological relations are the same. And maybe there's all this great critical thought in terms of how we think and relate to things in the university, but these ideas and these relationships are enclosed in this way. They're enclosed in corporate publishing. They're enclosed in libraries where you need security cards to go into them. They're enclosed also in the way that we don't think about these things and how these practices have kind of been taken and stripped from us. And of course, the biopolitics and necropolitics, the science of the state in terms of how it approaches people as a population. And we have to remember, in thinking of Foucault, that statistics is the science of the state. And that this is really the way we even think and talk about things, the way that we embody the vision and mind of the planner, the social engineer, the way that we're looking at different rhythms and algorithms in terms of looking at people as this mass to be controlled and operated within a political economy or a global political economy of capitalism. This goes to human and non-human domestication. You know, this really is about breaking people down. This really is about applying the techniques of the hunter, of the gardener to humans as a way to kind of break them and to put them in and to kind of subjugate them to different civilized, imperial, and also state systems. And obviously there's a hierarchy within state systems themselves. So one of the main things that I think is actually another clear continuity besides just about everything is this idea of counterinsurgency, which we'll get into in a moment. But this really is the formalized military and also police doctrine of population management and control, and which directly comes out of colonial warfare as a doctrine. It comes out of colonial warfare in Malaysia, Kenya, Northern Ireland. And maybe useful is to just remember in terms of what the purpose of war is. You know, we're going to go with the old European von Clausewitz, but there's probably a million people, but this is just the easy one I could think of. It's just, what is war? And war is thus an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. War, so just even this first sentence. So war is actually to institute servitude. Yeah, to really integrate, to assimilate, to institute servitude, to do our will, whatever our is. Thus, the means of war to impose our will on the enemy is its object. To secure that object, we must render the enemy powerless. And that, in theory, is the true aim of warfare. That aim takes the place of the object, discarding it as something not actually part of war itself. So yeah, the point of war is to integrate, to domesticate, to control. And the crazy thing about statism, it really is about this power. It's this competition with other states. But it's this, what is the purpose of all this? Is it really just capitalist political economy and to maintaining these structures? I think there's an existential crisis in terms of the purpose of actually being integrated in these structures and what it actually does and why it does it. And it's not a good way to live, to say it nicely. And yeah, and obviously with counterinsurgency and military technologies, the way that just this relationship of state/colonial powers doing what they can within the respective political context based on whatever racism mythology. So executing abhorrent colonial war, architecture restructuring. I'm thinking of George Baron Haussmann, where I think about the French were kind of instituting these things in Algeria, but then how this kind of architecture comes back and is applied to Paris in terms of actually how to put down uprisings and insurrections. But this idea, came from Hannah Arendt, Cesar, but this idea of the boomerang effect and how there's different laboratories of repression to be kind of exercising and creating these possibilities. So when it happens somewhere else, this means it's more likely to happen somewhere. So that's why these things have to stop everywhere. Everything's connected. And it's really sick and sad that now you have Israel, you have Brazil, you have Colombia. They have their own counterinsurgency manuals and doctrines. They have their own private security we're training and spreading these, thinking of Walter Rodney, the kind of techniques of scientific violence, which is the way to break people, make them do your will. And this really relates to counterinsurgency and also torture techniques. It's sickening stuff. Again, divide, conquer, safety and enchantment, social contract, just the strategies and tactics that are used to kind of be integrated into this larger whole of, we can just say, the Leviathan. And, building on Wolf, and something I said is that, this recognizes that the structure is also infrastructural, that this conquest really goes to modernity and infrastructure itself that sometimes we forget to question because of our dependence on it, but also our enchantment and what it's able to do. I mean, even just the bridge, what a bridge can do across a river is impressive, even though it has serious extractive impacts, let alone computers, computational technologies, and airplanes. But yeah, talk about counterinsurgency. Lieutenant David Kilcullen defines counterinsurgency as a competition with the insurgent for the right and ability to win the hearts, minds, and acquiescence of the population, where hearts are explained as persuading people their best interests are served by your success, and minds convincing them that you can protect them and that resisting you is pointless. This is the two-pronged approach, and that really counterinsurgency in general is a total governmental intervention in the lives of target populations that operationalize a variety of mutually reinforcing strategies. So, of course, when we think about counterinsurgency, we think about Vietnam, we think about the Middle East, we think about classical colonial warfare, which is ultimately conventional warfare. In Latin America, scorched earth, we're just kind of killing entire people, burning entire villages. But we can also relate this to paramilitary forces, riot police, targeted assassination, and things like this to kind of break movements. But I think the most underestimated, and I mean, part of this is also because of internal strife and fights within the military and police, within imperial powers, of actually the approach to do things. There's more enlightened and soft approach. But these things are always work together. And typically in colonial ventures, you are going to see a process of terrorizing, extermination to break people, to traumatize them. And then you're going to start seeing carrot and ways to integrate them into community development, model villages, development poles. They have different kind of names. But these soft and kind of indirect approaches operationalize civil administrations, development programs, public relations campaigns, media campaigns, we can just call these psychological operations, and employ public relations agencies themselves, NGOs, social scientists are always there trying to measure, understand, and kind of influence the social fabrics of people. And that's, again, this is social warfare, where it really is trying to intervene in the social, cultural, and psychological, and these relationships, but also people's psychologies and mentalities. And anthropologists, geographers, economists, agronomists, they all have something to pay and have had a hand in these things. I mean, development studies itself, all these studies actually come from these efforts or have a big hand in them. But in short, these kind of indirect approaches is every effort that the state has and government has to do these. And it's important, according to the 2014 manual, is often viewed by governments or resource extraction companies that, nonviolent protest is regarded as insurgency. And this comes from General Brigadier Kitson in Northern Ireland. He was in Malaya, Kenya, also Northern Ireland, and he conceived of insurgency in 3 phases. There is preparation, nonviolence, and insurgency. And so the idea of preparation is people organizing, talking, and forming things. Nonviolence wasn't maybe the nonviolence you think about today. This was barricades, rioting, expropriations. But then insurgencies was full kind of in Marxist-Leninist style, like armed insurgency. And of course, the military is thinking very rudimentary about group leaders and this kind of colonial form of organizing. And so that's how they saw it. But the point is that the whole point of counterinsurgency is to intervene in the preparation. Counterinsurgency is the declaration of total warfare on a population, a domestic population, to constantly be intervening in them at the earliest phases to prevent them from moving into nonviolence and insurgency, as it was conceived in 1969. This graph was in the last slide, but let's pull this up. This is actually from the indirect methods for counterinsurgency. And really what we have here is almost a model of kind of the watered down social democracy that we're familiar with. Education, empowerment, participation. So really, even the models that are kind of promoted for politics in and of themselves are celebrated in counterinsurgency manuals as an occupying force, as a method to actually kind of break people and to integrate them into these structures, to civilize them, we could say. And again, you know, political mobilization of the people through voting, youth programs, education, host nations. So this is obviously in the form of like formal kind of occupation and colonial warfare. But again, the same things you see in development, education, empowerment, participation. The word sustainability is lingering around that manual too. This is the model that's gone out. And the funny thing is in academia is the way that there's this complete failure to reflect on our own environments and our own quote polities and systems or the state itself and actually what they're designed to do, where they do. And I say this in the context where everyone wants to say they're a decolonial scholar. Everyone's decolonial this, diet, decolonize, their diet, international relations, the state, and all of these things. But this connection is always about the global south. It's always looking somewhere else and not looking in to actually their own situation, what's being perpetuated either in the streets or even within the university, which is a microcosm of the state and the whole colonial structure itself, I would argue. So yeah, the model of colonial occupation operates on the pillars of the modern liberal nation state. And again, in another work, Kilcullen is really blatting out counterinsurgency then, or counterinsurrection, seems to be an enduring human social institution that has been part of the role of virtually every government in history, and perhaps even partly defines what we mean by the word state. A great and honest, but also rather obvious admission in terms of these things. But for some reason, I feel like it has to be said rather bluntly, like this presentation is trying to do today. And he continues that today's counterinsurgencies may be 100% political. And this means engaging in psychological warfare, operationalizing NGOs, and doing these things before they get in conflict. The last slide, because I think this is going on a bit longer and we need to make sure we can talk about this, is what does this mean? What are the implications of what I'm saying? And this is really like, how do we locate the enemy and oppression where we are, yeah? How do we actually look at these and ground these struggles where we are? And how do we connect these with other struggles that are going on across the world and really finding this common interest towards liberation? And this means, and of course, this means like state decolonization, which all the pink tide countries in Latin America, Ecuador, Bolivia, Venezuela, everyone was talking about state decolonization. Well, there's many examples before these, but I think in terms of how, you know, political power was seized on the back of social movements there and how this turned out, I think it's pretty obvious once again, as history repeats itself, that this doesn't fly. Identity politics is being used to rebrand authoritarianism, usually a Leninism or Maoism, or liberalism within the academy. So this isn't fun if you're engaged in these struggles in the streets within global North countries, as you can call it. National liberation struggles, and this is a hard one, and this is the one thing that makes me feel a bit uncomfortable about this talk here, because it is really trying to get at the roots of the colonial system. But there always has been a clash in terms of how formal national liberation struggles, usually operating through some form of Marxist Leninism or Maoism, how they're ultimately trying to institute and reestablish a state, but obviously one that's less racist, obviously one that's actually more equal, one that's actually trying to challenge imperial powers. But at the same time, this doesn't actually really address some of the underlying, especially ontological and epistemological issues in terms of actually how, in practice, day-to-day, people are relating to their habitats and ecosystems. And this goes back to debates, and specifically in Palestine, and Alfredo and Bonanno, who this is dedicated to. You know, there was an active engagement in terms of talking about more anti-authoritarian methods of militant struggle, of actually how to organize this so it's not hierarchical, and so it becomes more viral and more difficult to stop. And this relates to other debates within different kind of action group circles about, you know, you have the dagger, these formalized, militarized armed groups, and then you have the virus. And there is a long history of watching a lot of the failures and breakdowns of some of these things. I mean, really, a lot of them, especially through Latin America. And I don't really want to get into saying the names of these things, but I think one of the most interesting examples in terms of how they've been reformulated the last 3 years is actually looking at how the FARC has developed in Colombia in terms of these things, and how ultimately after, in 2016, their leadership sold them out in Cuba and now taking positions in government. Go figure, this is often what happens with these groups. But there actually became a more horizontal and popular strategy that's been getting implemented and becoming, from what I've heard, rather successful since around 2020. It started to show results, but these things are always in flux. Hostile reflections on infrastructure. And this is, and as the presentation was kind of getting into, is to really is to really look at the infrastructures that we're so enchanted with, that we're on right now. And this is, obviously we're entangled in these things. And if you're an academic, you're likely addicted to weird academic journals and checking your email and smartphones and things like this. And we're in this, this isn't to take a high horse, but like, how can we even speak about this as a problem and maybe try to work through these things collectively? And this is really also a problem of science. And this is actually what I do more in my real job, in looking at supply chains related to low carbon infrastructures and how the kind of the hope and savior of climate change today through wind turbines, solar panels, and things like this are actually, and also energy infrastructure, are deeply tied into really extractive and ecocidal supply chains that no one really wants to own up to or talk about. And there's a whole plethora of science, data collection, and modeling that conceals these things rather well, which is what I talk about in the book tour right now that was mentioned. Again, architecture and planning, a big issue. We can get into this. I kind of want to just get through this. Again, the allure and enchantment of technology, kind of addiction to it. And in the academic journals, this is all well acknowledged. But in terms of like a lot of things, but in terms of reality, it's did. Again, urgent reflection on ideas of counterpower and statism, in terms of like actually reproducing these kind of same organizational methods, kind of common to colonial institutions through kind of resistance practices. Decolonial struggle is about space relations in urban and rural. So really actually kind of looking at this connection and also being more critical about urban, and really looking at gentrification as maybe an advanced and strategic and friendly colonization in terms of how the market is actually controlling space and squeezing everyone and squeezing out and displacing other people, often Black, brown, and kind of marginalized harder than others. And then again, urgent reflections on university. Decolonization is more than syllabus, kind of diversifying syllabus and employment. This requires an infrastructural reorganization and really critically going at the university for what it's doing, because those are spaces that are supposed to be making these changes and understanding these things, and that should be learning. But many of us are in these structures and know what that is. And again, this is about political anti-colonial affinity, not identity essentialism. This means it's really important to get at the political substance of what's trying to be created and about working towards total liberation, and not actually just celebrating the rebranding of oppressive structures. But so with that, I've given a lot of kind of things to think about and maybe to be annoyed at, but hopefully it's an interesting and kind of stimulating thing to look at that hopefully will bring us closer to maybe getting at the roots of some of these things. But with that, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Sander. Thank you. I will encourage now the audience to write, if they have questions, to write it in the chat. It will come direct to us. And before we start with your questions, let me begin with it's another topic that you not mentioned now, but it has to do with the term Anthropocene, which is so used today in the academy, or it get more I don't know. So you said that the Anthropocene concept has become a kind of new Western meta-narrative, which is beginning to be increasingly used in social science to talk about the impact of humans on the planet. But in doing so, we think it allows to eradicate the history of colonial and imperial domination of Europe and the US. And you rightly point in your work that this technology allows a certain neutrality, a legitimacy concerning human intervention, while at the same time it functions, and this as a little bit like your words, as a tool of government and a psychosocial manipulation. But you suggest that we should stop using this term on research. Can you expand a little bit more about this?
Yeah, this is from my new book, The System is Killing Us. Yeah, I mean, I don't see this term useful. I reject using that term. Usually anyone using that term, it's kind of a clear red flag that they're really not thinking about some of these issues. And there's so many different alternatives, and in every type of new scene that so many other academics have made. But yeah, I mean, it's obviously trying to homogenize the rest of the world and make them responsible for a lot of what different elite and industrial powers have done. You know, I mean, it's the Anthropocene's a bit of a tired one. But yeah, obviously Necrocene, even Capitalocene, Plantationocene are far better. If one needs to play this game of labeling and trying to control the world and to look at it from this big macro lens, I mean, a lot of this is a really big problem of the way how we're trying to conceive ourselves in the world, how everyone's trying to see themselves as some planner, some policymaker, some social engineer of the world, which also reflects in earth science, also reflects in geoengineering, which are ultimately dystopic ways of relating and seeing the world, which are trying to remedy by the same means that created the problems of really ecological disaster, ecocide, and climate change. And I think it's very flawed. And I would compel everyone to stop using the word Anthropocene and use one of the many different alternatives, or probably just bypass it.
Great, great. Thank you. You know, authors Joel Weinbright and Geoff Mann written this interesting book about possible scenarios of an increasing authoritarian state in climate crisis management. They call this climate leviathan. Now, to describe what we have been experiencing for some years now about regulating the condition of pollution, toxicities, and so on. In the end, it is the state that is the guarantee of capitalist development. No, in this regard, could you explain what makes the state as a device of control? Well, you talk a lot about this, but maybe focus on some issues as a device of control and surveillance, as a central entity in research on extractivism.
Yeah, I mean, this is often a kind of a struggle with Marxists who try to talk about, oh, capitalism came before the state and chicken and the egg kind of stuff. And I think Peter Gelderlos and many other anarchists have made, and also Fred Perlman have made great arguments about this. And it goes to a lot of the works that, take it back to civilization and things like this. But it's states have always been there. They've always used private corporate charters to engage in colonial ventures. They've always maintained and managed and facilitated the framework of extraction. And there's a lot of ways we can look at in terms of population, state making, and kind of what we were talking about with statism, either quote internally or externally in colonial ventures. The state has always been an instrumental framework to managing, to assessing this power, to creating and collecting, we can say collecting souls, and convincing them in many ways or forcing them to engage in different colonial ventures. And so, and I mean, this is a problem, this way of, the hyper kind of the liberal capitalism and the marketization of things, moving from a kind of the Keynesian model, is that, people are saying they miss the state, they miss some of the social welfare, even though it often always came at the expense of someone else in the global south or through different colonial ventures. And so now you see this more privatized model, and I'm thinking of mining in Peru in terms of the way the military and police are instrumental to maintaining these things, and are often making their own contracts directly with extraction companies, but still, it's still maintained and supported by the state. And I just can't stress enough that this kind of forced regulation in and of itself is the problem, because it reinforces to me what I conceptualize as an extremely kind of patriarchal process, where it's always been the dad of the household or the male or this big kind of politician or whatever political figure. And obviously this transcends genders with the way with gender integration, but still this very patriarchal idea that the authority of the household, of the state, is going to actually come with these solutions. It's going to regulate them. It's going to do the right thing. They know what's best for you. And this is also a way to not take responsibility for what's going on and to hope that it will be better or that the scientists will do it right. But really, this is why we need to care. We need to have, and this isn't about guilt either. This is about having fun. This is about becoming engaged. This is about living one's life and how they're engaging with it and being more conscious about it. And actually obviously working from one's own life in the grassroots and networking from there to make those changes immediately and network in solidarity as much as one can to make environments better places. This means improving soil quality. This means improving water quality, air quality, tree, animal, and everyone's life and your own relations. So I think this has, contrary to a lot of the kind of the Leninist programs, I think this is really important that people take this shit seriously and begin organizing themselves to do this. And this has to be decentralized and out of control. the best it can be so it can happen.
Yeah. Great, Sander. Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Sander. Someone raised his hand. I don't know if he want to jump in or maybe write the question in the chat. If there is not another question, I will continue. If I can. Okay, I will continue. Well, this is a little bit a general question, seeing our context now, seeing the climate of war that we are currently experience with this kind of Russian threat, and that is beginning to take on other contours with the destruction of Palestinian life in Gaza and the persecution of dissident thought. These are signs that concern us greatly. And what do you think is our role as researcher of an insufferable reality that is constantly recreated by the necropolitics and its devices that constantly dehumanize its victims? Or in other words, how do we navigate within the complicit space of Western academia in the series of attacks of freedom of thought and opinion? What are your thoughts about this?
Sorry, I'm having a hard time navigating Zoom still. Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of left speechless in terms of this way, especially in the German context, the way that, yeah, people are being suppressed from speaking out against what is a very clear case of genocide. But really, it's at this point, and it's kind of like what I just said, is that, I mean, people have to be active and to do everything they can from where they stand, from their skills and abilities to stop this, to make space, to stand up against this. This might just mean be as simple as kind of speaking out loud and talking with people about it, and opening those conversations, making posters, filing complaints, doing things within your university. And then there's a whole other level of action that can go off after that. There's so many things to do. And I think the more imaginative and creative people can do it, the better. But it's being in, I mean, universities, they're not so nice. I think if I knew actually how exploitative they are and how much I would find myself working to try to exist. Luckily, I'm like deeply upset and traumatized and have a lot to say about it, that I would have never ever gone this path in my life. And it's really shameful the way that things are and just how deeply exploitative, hierarchical, and really just the way, and even the corporate publishing that's attached to it, that's really just trying to crank out stuff and put it behind paywalls, and the lack of quality being put into these things as well. But it's, yeah, in short, struggle, continue, organize, find your friends, do what you can, and make sure you're doing it for fun. Make sure that if this really sickens you and it upsets you, then it's actually going to be a really fun thing to do, to take it apart piece by piece and to make interventions into it. And to make friends doing it.
It's what we are doing. Yeah. Thank you. Here's a question from Mustafa. He said, Xander has addressed political economy and political ecology, but what of political theology? I suggest the need to question whether capitalist accumulation is the ultimate ground of the colonial project, inviting us to consider the assertion of supremacy in some pseudo-divine or divine sense as an alternative and or complementary driver. Sorry, I read it really bad. I don't know if it was understandable, Xander. Do you can see the question?
Yeah, I'll pull it up. I just the share screen. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I do speak about political economy as being kind of one of the main drivers. But obviously there is, I mean, sometimes I like to conceptualize a bit, obviously a bit simplistic and crude, that you have the more kind of liberal and enlightened way, which is more about expanding capitalism and capital accumulation. And then you have really proper, hardcore conservative ways that is about the bloodline. It's about the aristocracy, you can say, and it is truly and fundamentally insecure and racist in terms of how it conducts itself and a lot of its motivations. And this is obviously more clear in classical colonial ventures and still surfaces today. And as Cesar said, this is fascism. Fascism is a very clear expression of this. And there's many different types of fascism, and especially how they voice themselves through technology and capital accumulation. But obviously, I think there's a couple of these motivations in terms of this kind of real full-blown racial supremacy. But I think the reason why I emphasize the more liberal and enlightened way is that how you get a lot of do-gooders, you get a lot of NGOs, you have a lot of, people that don't want to do bad and would never conceive themselves as racist or doing these things, being kind of coaxed into or acquiescing to, whether it's through new green technologies and saving the world in this really uncritical way that comes out of like public relations in the 1970s that even started talking about renewable energy and energy transition. But I think it is really this more liberal mass and this enlightened way that there is not a deeper questioning of industrial society, of the state, of this kind of the planning of the cities that we're in, that we're living in structures that are modeled after prisons and designed and used with toxic waste to be extracted from the earth. Like we're in the houses and the infrastructures we're in, this is built with toxic waste. Like these aren't the healthiest environments. It's great to be dry from the rain, and there's a lot of ways to be warm and dry from the rain. But the way that people are being stacked on each other and the materials that are being used and the cost this has is severe. But again, I think it goes more to the fundamental kind of aspects of, what is the purpose of society. And I agree, and I think certainly this kind of racial supremacy and kind of classical fascist or classical colonialist, which is more accurate and earlier, is of course a driving force.
Yeah, great. I'm Chilean, and you maybe know about the efforts to write a new a new constitution for the country. Yeah, and we failed in 2020 with our ecological constitution. And it is interesting to see how in Latin America, many leftist groups are looking to Europe and the social democrat and in some way the state and the rights that the state as a guarantee of rights. And this was in some way the frame for this ecological constitution in Chile, and this was rejected. But it's interesting to see the development of the state now here in Europe. But this is in some way for many people and for many leftist people from the global south, I think they are looking to Europe and this kind of state formation. And you know that we in Chile we were a kind of neoliberal experiment. So we are trying to get out of this kind of subsidiary state.
Yeah, what's the question exactly?
No, it was a comment. It was much more a comment. Okay.
No, but I think one of the important things, and I think it's a great example because what was happening in 2019 in Chile and just the level of street fighting and demonstrations, but really the kind of the hardcore fighting, which sustained for a very long time and took so many injuries. It was just really hard because everyone, I mean, especially a lot of the anarchist combatants and people in Chile, everyone knew, a lot of people knew that it was this new constitution and all this was a diplomatic tactic to try to break people and to end it. And some people were aware of this, many people were, but at the same time, people were so exhausted from fighting day in and day out, being on the streets, not to mention, being hungry from doing this and losing jobs and all these things like this. And I think what happened in Chile recently really brings up the true dilemma and really kind of gets to this point of kind of warfare, how people are worn down and how it's hard to keep fighting. It's hard to continue doing this. And if there's a ceasefire, if there is some type of kind of out or a way to kind of continue to make things be a little less messed up, that still, even when people see the trap coming, they take it because just the fighting is so severe.
Yes, yes. Now you see the comments, Xander. I will read some of these here.
You know what? I don't see any of the comments.
No, you don't see it? Well, I will try to read it.
You can send it to me too if it helps.
It was Adventino. Adventino writes, he said before, many thanks to the chair and our presenter for this. My name is Adventino, a PhD fellow at Makerere University in Kampala. Perhaps the challenge relates to thinking critically about the state in a historical and indeed contextual fashion, having all state forms functioning in this same colonial fashion across time and space. Is a question. How should the difference between pre-modern, pre-colonial, and on the one hand, and colonial and modern state forms on the other inform your views on the discourse on decolonizing the state? Two questions.
Yeah. Yeah, for the first, of course, there's going to be differences, and maybe some of this is out of my reach in terms of specificities and historical developments. But at the same time, I would say that, I make a distinction between structural and superficial differences. And I worry that there aren't much structural differences, but there's a lot of superficial differences, that is painting and beautifying a certain type of infrastructure, especially with an integration of indigenous people or things like this. And so I can't necessarily answer that question, but I think my big concern and kind of what motivates this is that ultimately you had a colonial model exported across the world, beaten and terrorized into people, and people who took up and internalized these structures and reprojected them in the global south. Let any gated community in Latin America or Asia or wherever be exemplars of this. And not to mention the different infrastructures, the modernism and the things like this. And obviously there's a lot of work about the histories of different architectures and things like this and how they're passed about. So my concern in saying this, despite being, I think, an immense amount of, I would call, superficial differences. And when I say superficial, it's not to say there aren't meaningful reforms or differences in these things, because I think they are. And the reforms can be meaningful and are meaningful, but it doesn't maybe get to the roots enough and challenges what I think is really important. And this is obviously, and I'm pointing at infrastructure, I'm pointing at relations to nature. I'm talking about the way that urbanism is taking place and spreading. And so I would identify, as with the picture behind us, is that we're seeing urbanisms that are rather similar, with similar dysfunctional ecological relationships, even though, of course, in favelas, people are exercising and moving these things in rather impressive ways and using this. So it's not to actually be down on that, but it is to look at the wider problem of ecocide and urbanism and the way that these structures are being organized, the way that paramilitaries, narcos, all these different police, also the way that imperial powers have advised and enforced these things throughout the years, that these structures and really this development of leaders in and of themselves. And this is something really important by Peter Gelbelus, is really looking at how colonial powers needed to institute and create leaders with indigenous societies. And if they already existed, it was all that more easier to begin integrating, trading, manipulating, lying, and pegging them against other indigenous groups. So, of course, there's lots of different states. I'd say that many of it is superficial differences that, of course, have meanings, but there are deeper and structural things that, and I think I'm not answering the second question properly. What was the second part?
The second question was, how would the difference, how would the difference between pre-modern, pre-colonial on the one hand and colonial and modern state from the other inform your views on the discourse on decolonizing the state?
Oh yeah, and so I don't really believe you can decolonize the state. And maybe this is why I believe anti-colonial struggle is really important. I think that it's a structure and a technology that obviously is very useful, very practical, and I think there's a lot of utopian ideas of how to seize it and what you can do with it. But I think along with anarchist theory, these are structures and technologies. The state is a psychosocial technology that will change you, that will take much time. It will put you in a position to make you see and understand the world in a certain type of way that, again, will affirm a process that I think is the fundamental problem. And it's how we're living, relating, and being in the world. And so, yeah, and again, I reference the pink tide countries as a very serious problem in terms of this. And this is just a recent example. There's many examples. There's a lot of historical examples. But again, obviously, I think there can be benefits from these things. But I think there's huge traps, big problems, and even bigger issues that aren't being addressed or talked about through this. And I think maybe the scariest thing about the state is this idea of seizing the means of production, this idea of seizing the state and instituting what you think is best, and really exerting that type of power, especially given one's upbringing, education, integration of modern infrastructure, class, race, all this, gender, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Xander and Adventino, for your questions. There's another question, Usman. Xander, you have talked about statism as colonialism. Does the routes through which different forms of state emerge in the global north and the global south have impacts on your position? Statism is colonialism?
I mean, not so much. I mean, I feel like that's very similar to the last question in a lot of ways. And you can look at this, and again, I locate this with empire. We can go from Chinese dynasties to Mesoamerican empires, and of course, there are differences. There's friendlier aspects. There's also other brutal aspects. But again, they're labeled as empires for a reason, or dynasties. And there are, again, a lot of superficial differences. There's different kind of organizational technologies that operate in them. And for me, what I really liked and was very poetic is actually Freddie Perlman's against his story, against Leviathan, that actually took a very poetic prose to actually talk about states as mechanical worms, and mechanical worms that would fight with themselves, decompose on themselves, create and spread into different types of mechanical worms, and octopuses that was actually a symbol for transatlantic travel, and really how there are these different models forming and shaping and evolving. And so, of course, there's differences, but again, there's still different types of beasts, or I mean, I feel like it gives a bad name to beasts, some of these things that we're talking about, but it gives a bad names to these beasts, or these mechanical cyborg worms and creatures that are bent on collecting and consuming people and souls to actually fight and struggle. So again, of course, there are big differences between civilizations, between different empires, but there are structural similarities. And even when there's differences, they're somehow creating a similar product in the end. So no, I guess the answer is no, it doesn't change. Even though it's not a popular answer, and it doesn't make, the answer is no, I don't think it makes that much difference for what we're facing today. And I know that there's a lot of people, specifically from the Marxist camp, who want to, and also a decolonial Marxist camp, that really want to believe that there's different states that can be formed that are going to be decolonial. And I think Max Asia actually has some very good examples, and I respect a lot of the work that they do, talking about how there are actually different states that are being developed and engaging in agriculture in different ways. But I think there are serious structural problems with the state that's being done that we can't be overlooked, and it can't be excused away by other imperial powers and how they're tampering and conditioning these things. And I mean, there's a whole other story in terms of puppet governments and state governments in these countries, and how they've been selling off their own people to Western powers or different corporations along the way. And so there is something to be said about those internal struggles in those areas.
Great. Thank you, Xander. And thank you, Usman, for your question. Here's another one, much more related to Germany. What do you think could effectively break the German mainstream narrative of the Zionist state of reason?
I mean, look, I remember, what year is it? I remember 13 or 14 years ago, 15 years ago, learning about the anti-Deutsch. I don't even say it right. Where I ultimately heard about how there was autonomous black bloc anarchist-style tactics being deployed and engaging with things, with people waving around Israeli flags. This blew my mind. Um, I'm choking on my words. I can't even understand how there's going to be people that are engaging in anarchistic and autonomous struggle in Germany and a part of those spaces and squats and counter institutions who are somehow thinking it's okay to to engage in a full-blown genocide and invasion of exterminating women, children, wrecking their homes, and what infrastructure was still standing from the last 30, 40 years of horrendous warfare being waged, and warfare and enclosure being waged against them. I mean, I don't, it feels very hopeless to me. You know, this is a very clear sign. Obviously, there's a lot of reporting and the sanitizing of media that's going on. There's all this, everyone's confused what's real, what's not going on. So maybe there's some kind of issues with actually what people are able to see and do. Maybe there needs to be more trips of of Germans going down and actually entering Gaza and going into a war zone to kind of witness what's going on. Like, I don't know what's going to, you know, clearly just rattling numbers of 61,000 people and civilians being killed isn't enough. And I'd be that statistic's probably 80,000 by now. You know, I'm thinking about a month ago. I don't know what can be done for Germans to actually look at and to see what's going on. At this point, it looks like there needs to be a lot of field trips to go on and actually go taste and see what conventional warfare looks like and what living under drones, facing bulldozers and automated sniper towers is going to do to you. So, yeah, please have empathy with people that are being exterminated. Please care. Like, it's shocking. I don't know. Yeah. And what's even more mind-boggling is that you have this tradition of armed struggle that's celebrated in Germany, and you have everyone clamoring and clapping about Rojava and the kind of armed struggle there. But somehow, I'm hearing that there's divisions where people supporting this are somehow turning their back on Palestine. I don't know. Hopefully, I'm just hearing rumors about how bad the situation is in Germany. But I guess the only thing that comes to mind is it's time to start organizing field trips into a war zone for Germans and anyone else that's having a hard time and thinks it's funny to celebrate this. So that sounds like there might be a lot of field trips from people in the United States and on occupied Turtle Island who need to start doing that.
Yeah, Jorge is clapping. Thank you, Xander. Thank you. Here's another one. I think it's an insider who knows about theory. Hi, Alexander. I'm Vedant Gupta. No, sorry. I lost myself. It was another one. Here. Sorry. Anya Heron. She said, I'm curious about your ending on the illustration of Starhawk's fifth sacred thing. What anarchist imaginaries or theorizing do you find most compelling? Are you influenced by solar punk and the resurgence of Buchin by libertarian municipalism? Sorry, sorry, my English. I hope it was understandable.
Libertarian municipalism. I have a hard time saying it in English. Libertarian municipalism. Was that it?
It was understandable, the question, Sander?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm going to be honest. I'm just pulling images off of the website, off the internet to try to actually have a more imaginative future, you know? And so in terms of the reason why I have that image there, I mean, there's ways we can critique this image very easily, but yes, in general, I think that...
Sander, sorry to interrupt you. Can you come a little bit more closer to because of the audio, please?
But yeah, I more or less just put that image there just to try to have something a bit more positive in the ways that we see things. And I guess the short answer is, yeah, I think that if we're going to actually engage in urban space, I think it's important that we start growing food vertically. I think it's important we start depaving roads. I think that we do everything we can if we're urban population, if we're people who are living in urban areas, to really begin doing everything we can to start reconnecting with the land that is there and start taking the lead out of the soil, growing food, creating different kind of animal habitats so we can actually begin developing and really affirming our relationships with different animals, whether they're cats, dogs, birds, raccoons, foxes, and do whatever we can to actually improve our connection with the land there, with the water, with the trees, with the animals, and how to actually integrate kind of the existing urban infrastructures to make them more livable, to make better relations around them, collectivizing them in certain ways, and doing what can be done. And so I'm a huge critic of low carbon infrastructures or lower carbon infrastructures, but I am a big fan of micro scale wind, solar, even micro hydro, and also applying these things. I mean, I really believe in that it's important to take back your power, literally and metaphorically, and to really break kind of the hold of the grid, and to become autonomous in this way, and to know what, and this also means it's about scale, and to know what you're consuming, to be kind of a part of these processes, to have them, to know what they are, and so they can't be taken away easy, and to know that you're not going to be abusing them, like how it's so easy to abuse things now with the Google clicks and how much energy that uses, and the mining that often goes into those infrastructures, and just the switch of a light. And in terms of, so yeah, I really would want to conceive making something like this. I mean, there's issues with these things, and I think always, you know, there needs to be supply chain solidarity. There always needs to be, if one is, I think one has to be doing these things in their neighborhoods and locally and organizing this. And there's a local political struggle, which is paving roads and doing this, and whatever police forces or racism or things are going on in those areas. But there is also the important need of having, I guess, quote, solidarity supply chain, having solidarity across supply chains. So be working with people, obviously, who are in genocidal situations, be supporting them and doing what you can, but also more practically and figuring out how to actually create real renewable relationships, but also supply chains, and actually really trying to close these things and to begin like not just recycling more, but to really be supporting the people that are around these mines and who are fighting them in Latin America, the continent of Africa and Asia. So yeah, this is just to say, yeah, I think that some type of vision like this is worth instituting. And sure, radical municipalitarianism, that's a way that things can be organized. And I kind of see that more of the kind of the bioregional model that was kind of proposed in the late 80s, which had very clear ways of organizing politics, economy, ecology. You know, this is coming out of the northeast of the US. Sure, this is a way that one can kind of conceive and take these tools and use these as they've been done in Rojava, but in that way. But am I a flag-waving Bookchinite who thinks that's the way to go? No, not at all. But I think it is definitely a way that is definitely something that can be done. And really, it's about people doing what they can based on their politics, culture, and history, and making those changes and working with others who want to really create and make healthier spaces ecologically and socially.
Yeah, great. Great. Thank you, Sander. We have two questions more. I think we can do it with the time available. Usman, who made the question about the difference of the state in the global north and the global south, he made a comment. He said, in this sense, the global south is facing double blind one. On the one hand, colonization, and on the other hand, form of colonization in terms of statism. He commented this. And yeah, thank you, Usman.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. It's yeah, I mean, so there's I mean, and I think this is the difference between people and their governments. Yeah. Obviously, there's a voting base to a degree. Sometimes these margins are very low. Sometimes they're coerced. Sometimes there's different things like this. But I always think it's a big problem when people are equating a self-identification of a population of people with their own government, because this isn't always the case. And there's a lot of rebellion and resistance and internal frictions in different indigenous nations and people that do not necessarily identify with these people that speak on behalf of them publicly and nationally to try to get more resources to plunder or put in their pockets or to do different things. So most certainly there's that statism, yeah. And then there is this competition between states and the subordination of imperial nations trying to keep control and manufacture debt and do all these things, which again, a lot of these leaders are trained in different military academies in England and France. A lot of them are a cadre that were kind of put in there in the formal end of the decolonial era. So and have been completely irresponsible in what they were doing. And sometimes when they were responsible, and there are so many different hardcore struggles to actually end those processes. But sometimes this idea of separating the political from the economic was a bait and switch that actually, yeah, it continued the neo-colonial process.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question, Vedant. Hi, Alexander. I'm Vedant Gupta, a fourth-year law student in India. It is well known that ecocide was coined after the environmental assault on Vietnam by America during Vietnam War. Do you think that ecocide committed during war is out of colonial mindset, that environment is a commodity that is damaged during armed conflict, or it is committed out of military necessity?
Yeah, I mean, so first, of course, I mean, the environment's completely degraded and disrespected. You know, ecocide is not even recognized as a law. And I think there's actually been really good criticisms of ptericidia. Ptericidia and terracide are as actually a way to actually include kind of the different epistemologies of the land, to actually maybe kind of critique ecocide or to add to it, to show that there's actually a lot more being lost when you're attacking the land. But yeah, certainly I mean, in and of itself, ecocide maybe suffers a bit of a kind of suffers some limitations that I think deicide is actually opening up. But I mean, there's so many problems. I mean, I mean, even if ecocide was brought into, I mean, how well is international law working right now for Palestine? How well is international law working against the U.S. when they were mining the harbors in Nicaragua in the 80s? You know, international law is not working so well. And you know, I've been in these conversations with genocide and ecocide, and this was brought up years ago in a conference. And there's just kind of like, even if ecocide was a law, next thing you know, the U.S. or whatever imperial power or country is going to start invading countries on the basis of ecocide. So I think there's really, I mean, it's just, I mean, I just want to say, like, what I'm saying is sad. Like, I don't like this. Like, this isn't funny. I would like these things to work. I'd really like genocide and ecocide not to be happening in this world. But these institutions don't seem trustworthy, and they aren't doing their job for what they're supposed to be doing. And certainly, I think there's two folds of it. I think for the most part, there's a lot of not giving a shit and just bombing areas and destroying ecosystems. Yeah, completely. The ontology, the flat ontology, or whatever you want to call it, is in full effect. But there are, I think, in certain areas, there is. I mean, and I think we could talk in Palestine about the water. You know, I think there are very strategic maneuvers to actually isolate and control resources and to bleed people in certain ways. So the answer is, I think it's both. We want to be quick about it, but yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Xander. One last question before we go. We have 2 minutes. Adventino asked, in which sense should we think of the present as neo-colonial? If we are to if we are to generalize the category colonial to any state form.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I'm not seeing these things in the chat. Some of them just started popping up, but they were direct messages.
I don't think it's only to me. He said, in which sense should we then think of the present as neo-colonial, if we are generalize the category colonial to any state formation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that first of all, by saying this is to actually recognize that you're saying these same relations, you're saying these same infrastructures, these same technologies of repression rolled out everywhere, but there are differences in the degree and the intensity of them being rolled out. Yeah. And I think Usman said it well. You're seeing double colonialisms. You're seeing those models that were put in place a long time ago being enacted, and then you're seeing them being kind of hit again a second time, often through international financial institutions and other weird different business negotiations and things like this. So yeah, I like this idea of this kind of double colonialism happening. And I think, and for me, the purpose is to actually highlight the commonalities of struggle, the roots of issues that keep reproducing this system, and how to hit these things. And I think I do agree that there needs to be a certain sensitivity in how this is used, but I think there is an insane amount of commonality in terms of the structures being put on people. Yeah, but again, some people are being hit with harder intensities that aren't even fucking funny in terms of what it's doing. And it's so abhorrent. But but the whole point of this is I think we really need to look critically at these structures. We need to look critically at these political structures that we can call the state. We can look at their structural similarities, and we can see there's superficial differences in the products that they're making. And obviously we want to believe that these states can be used to protect things and to fulfill social contracts and to protect ecosystems and maintain culture and identity. And maybe they can to a degree, but I would like to raise it as a problem in terms of what's been done, how it's going, and how this might just be a larger kind of colonial trap that we're kind of falling in, and that's reinforcing itself. And I think that's the scariest thing, is that when you have this more conservative, brutal, and overt oppression and violence, this is reinforcing and making the softer versions of it more palatable. And of course, we'd rather be in a low intensity war zone. We'd rather be subject to a symbolic infrastructural, I don't know if this is true, but some might say that they'd rather be subjected to an infrastructural, symbolic, epistemological violence, which is common, as opposed to full-blown conventional scorched earth warfare, genocidal warfare. But I think we can't get lost in that kind of hardcore violence, that this other stuff and what's being reproduced isn't funny in the way that actually ecosystems, people, cultures, and ways of being, and how we're ultimately being confined to this type of political economy, and also this kind of these overt and covert racisms in these environments that aren't being bombed. And at least if they're being hovered by drones, they're not actually shooting Hellfire missiles, but they're observing people, monitoring them, and intervening in their social medias in a certain way or whatnot. But I think we can't get lost in seeing the really hardcore, brutal violence and how that actually reinforces these other structures and models that are also violent, but not in the same way, and they're going to have long-term consequences, and are having long-term consequences.
Great. Sander, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have you here. We come now to an end. I apologize for that we passed a little bit over the time. Before you go, let's remind you that Sander will present his book, The System is Killing Us, here in Berlin, in the Zielona in Grünberger Straße 73 in Berlin, in this Monday, 8 o'clock. So, yes. So that people know it. Thank you very much for all your questions and your presence. It was really wonderful. So, and
Yes.
maybe you can see us then Monday. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thank you for all the questions. And here's a punk flyer of all the different kind of book tour talks I'll be giving this next, 10 days or 8 days.
Great. Thank you. And bye-bye.
Thanks so much, DeCoco. Thanks for the work you're doing. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.